Yeah, his appointment, his papers, right? It was about property. I want my property. How about McCullough?
The bank.
Yeah, it was about the bank and the property and all that was involved. What about Gibbons and Ogden?
The rights to own the river.
Yeah, the shipping and all that. So this was about property and it was about those kinds. Let's take a look at the next case. We'll come right back to that. We're going to talk about Dred Scott. You guys remember this from your history lessons, right? I mean, generally, what was it about?
Civil rights.
It was about civil, well, no.
Like slavery.
Yeah, it's kind of about slavery, but it's really about what?
Property?
Well, it's about property. Who's the property?
Dred Scott.
So, and when you first look at it, you think it's about, civil rights and all. Nah, it's about property. It's about Dred Scott. Because, and we'll talk about it. We'll get back to it. The second half of, the last 125 years, guess what most Supreme Court cases are about?
Civil rights.
Yeah. They're about civil rights. Good or bad, that's what's happened. The first half of our, country's life has been about property rights. The second half has been about our civil rights, no doubt. Let's talk about Dred Scott. Dred Scott, the case. He accompanies his former owner. Actually, it was his ladyship. His former master had died, and then she was heir to he as property. Traveled, I believe, from Missouri to Illinois, and then even on to Wisconsin, and lived outside of the sort of slave zone for, 6 months or something. It was quite a while. And, this was, the date on this is what,
1846.
Is that right?
Person died.
No, it can't be. It's 18 what? 57. It's 1857, just before the Civil War, right? So, because the Civil War begins in 1860. So, just before the Civil War, Dred Scott goes with his... Now, you remember the whole Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 and all that? If you remember, Missouri, half of it actually was above the Mason-Dixon line. And so, when you thought about it coming in as a slave state, you sort of thought, well, wait a minute, it's above the Mason-Dixon line. Take a look at a map.
So
here.
that's when we made the new state, right?
Yes.
Okay.
When you take a look, here's this Mason-Dixon line that runs just like this. And it kind of came up here, and it came up to south of Iowa. Well, actually, when you look at, all of this was free up here. When you look at Missouri, most of Missouri, latitude-wise, falls in sort of the free area. Only a little sliver down here. But because slaves had established, or slavery had established themselves in Missouri, when they came in or wanted to come in as a state, they said, hey, in 1850, we'd like to come in as a slave state. Of course, that threw, a monkey in the wrench because now you have more slave states than free states. So that's when we took Massachusetts, which was this here and all of this up here, only separated a little bit by New Hampshire. And they said, well, let's do this. Let's take Massachusetts, divide it in half, and we'll call this Maine and this Mass, and that way they can come in as a slave state, this will be a free state, and we'll still be equal. And so that's what happened in that compromise making, or the Missouri Compromise. Along with that came some other things, like, okay, if slaves run away, you got to return them, and do you remember all that? Yeah, you remember that. So when you took a look at the Dred Scott case, it kind of like, he runs away, he's sort of saying, hey, wait a minute, I left. When I came back, what does he do? He sues for his right to be a free citizen and to go back. He says, hey, look, I was out, I crossed the Mason-Dixon line, I lived there, and then I was forced back. I want my freedom. It's a very simple case. I want my freedom. I lived in a free state. What did the judge say? Justice Taney, or Taney, if you will, a Southerner, former slaveholder owner himself, now the Chief Justice led the majority on this and basically said, look, you're not a citizen. You're a piece of property. You don't get your day in court. You know, if you were more than a piece of property, you know, you're no different than any other animal or any other possession that's on the farm. You don't get your day in court, therefore you can't sue. And the case was over. Now, at first the case, you think to yourself, so what's the big deal? Why bring this up? Well, the reason that I do is for a couple of reasons here. One is that I think actually what the case was all about, and I brought this to your attention last year, the case was really about just before the Civil War, 1857, the Civil War is just 3 years later, just before the Civil War, what did, you know, up until this point we had been sort of compromising our way through this, and now things were getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and what were we saying? We went to the Supreme Court and said, please solve our problem. Please solve our problem. And the Supreme Court simply said, we're not solving our problem. This is your problem. If you don't want slavery, then you pass a law that outlaws it. This is your problem. So one of the important things here is that it was about the time period. And it was about the United States thinking that the Supreme Court could rule on slavery and make it all go away. And the Supreme Court said, it's not our job. We do not legislate. That's your job. You want to get rid of slavery? Pass a law. Pass a law that gets rid of slavery. The second thing is that I think it demonstrates over the course of several cases the flexibility of the American Constitution. Because it shows our position. By the time we instill the 13th Amendment after the Civil War and we outlaw slavery, this is no longer a case, but now we enter that period in American history where we pass all the Jim Crow laws, we discriminate, we prejudice. So I throw that in there because it's such an important case for a couple of reasons. One is that it demonstrates the Supreme Court's lack of response to the sort of idea of legislating from the bench. That's what we call it. To legislate means to pass laws. And if the Supreme Court would have somehow ruled in Dred Scott's case and said that he was a citizen and he got his day in court, what would he really be saying?
Slavery was illegal.
That slavery was illegal. You don't have to go to court. Citizens are citizens, and citizens can't be what?
Property.
Property. They can't be slaves.
But they can be commerce.
But they can't be commerce. Absolutely. But that was the point, is that the second that the Supreme Court agreed with Dred Scott and said, you're right, you get your day in court, the Supreme Court would have been saying what? You're not property, you're a citizen, you get your day in court, and that would have automatically expunged all slavery and said it's over with. So the Supreme Court looks at this and says, wait a minute, you're asking us to get rid of slavery for you. It's not our job. We don't legislate from the bench. We simply rule on the constitutionality of something. The Constitution said what about slavery?
It was okay.
It was okay. It's legal. It's legal. If you don't like it, then go deal with it. Go initiate an amendment and change the Constitution. That's why this case is so important. Here's the case, Dred Scott. You know it. What was the outcome of it? Supreme Court said, don't get your day in court. What does it establish? Yeah, it does. It promotes slavery, and
But
I
it-
would agree with you.
Establishes the lack of bench legislation.
Right.
Like it shows that the courts can't do that. Basically, right?
Basically, it says exactly that. That's the best way to put it, is that it demonstrates the Supreme Court's inability to legislate from the bench. It would be unconstitutional to rule something unconstitutional if it was legislated from the bench. Although, you know what? That's what the argument was with the three judges and more when the sort of fundamentalist, radical Christian groups in this state pushed to have our three judges dismounted or dislodged, call it what you will. They said, hey, they're legislating from the bench. They're passing laws that say, marriage between same-sex partners is okay. And they were saying, we're not doing that at all. We're just simply saying you can't pass any laws that do that because it would go against your civil rights. That's not legislating from the bench. Good, Scott. Next case. Is it Plessy? 96?
Search.
I know you've heard this case before. I've said it many times. Plessy Ferguson, 1896. The war's been over now 30 years. 30 years the war's been going over. For the first 10 years after the war, there were federal districts, military districts that kept blacks in the Deep South safe. You remember that? Freedmen's Bureau, military districts. And then in the Tilden-Hayes election of 1876, you remember that? They couldn't elect. They couldn't get enough electoral votes. And so this went on for a period of time until finally Southerners said, tell you what we'll do. We'll switch a couple of votes. You can elect Rutherford B. Hayes as long as you withdraw the military districts. Remember that?
No, I don't.
1876, Tilden versus Hayes. There was not enough electoral votes on either one. And so it automatically goes to the House of Representatives. And the House voted several times and still couldn't elect a president. And finally, in negotiations, Southern Democrats said, tell you what we're going to do. We'll cast votes with you in the North. We'll elect Rutherford B. Hayes. You must withdraw the military districts, withdraw the Freedmen's Bureau, and pretty much, let's get back on track. The Northern Republicans agreed. They elected Rutherford B. Hayes, and the door was closed on the Deep South. So from about 1877, which is when the federal districts were closed and withdrew, until 1896, we see the Jim Crow law epidemic take place. And all of these laws that were passed in the Deep South that chased African Americans out of local legislatures and segregated basically whites from blacks. In fact, we were studying this. Look at here. I got a whole list of these Jim Crow laws. Look what it says. Nurses, no person or corporation shall require any white female nurse to nurse in wards or rooms in hospitals, either public or private, in which Negro men are placed. Buses, all passenger stations in this state, and that was in Alabama, all passenger stations in this state are operated by any motor transportation company shall have separate waiting rooms or space and separate ticket windows for white and colored races. Restaurants, pool halls, toilet facilities, intermarriage, all made in cohabitation, education, schools had to be separate. On the back, juvenile delinquents. We were wanting white kids, naughty white kids, hanging with naughty African American kids because. Mental hospitals, barbers, burial. The officer in charge shall not bury or allow to be buried any colored persons upon ground set apart or used for burial of white persons. I don't want to be laying there dead, cold in the ground thinking, this is a black guy dead in the ground next to me. What is that? What is that? Come on. How about this one? Amateur baseball. I love this one. It shall be unlawful for any amateur white baseball team to play baseball on any vacant lot or baseball diamond within 2 blocks of a playground devoted to the Negro race. And it shall be unlawful for any amateur colored baseball team to play baseball in any vacant lot or baseball diamond within 2 blocks of any playground devoted to the white race. White kids didn't want to be embarrassed because the black kids would have just killed them in baseball. So it's like 2 blocks away, okay? That way they'd never have to play each other. Parks and Rec, wine and beer, reform school, circus tickets. If you wanted to go to the circus, there'd be entryway for the colored race and an entryway for the white race. Housing, the same thing. Jim Crow laws. Plessy, 1896, an octoroon, only 1/8 African American. Visually, he's white as you and me. Announces, lets it be known that he's going to get on a passenger trolley in New Orleans and sit in the white section. It was staged, and we've done a lot of this. The Scopes monkey trial was staged, and any number of, because once it's staged and it ends up then there being a complaint, it can go to the Supreme Court. He sits on the white section. When he sits down, he's told he has to move. He says no. He's arrested, going to jail, and ends up in the Supreme Court. What do they argue? They argue that the fact that transportation and train services are separated is in some way against the Constitution and the civil rights of the person to sit where they want to. When the Supreme Court looked at the case, and they looked at this document, they said, you know what? We've discovered that this Constitution protects the rights of citizens from political discrimination. You shouldn't be kept from voting, from running for office, for being a Republican or a Democrat or whatever you want to be. And likewise, this document protects your economic rights. That if you want to be this or that occupation, or you want to invest that money, or you want to buy this or buy that, you should be able to. But nowhere in this document does it say anything about social segregation. No place at all. As long as, and what's born out of the Plessy-Ferguson case?
Separate but equal.
You bet. America's separate period of separate but equal. As long as the facilities are equal, as long as where I sit in the circus tent and the African American sits in the circus tent are equal, it's all good. As long as the black school and the white school have equal services, it's fine. What's the problem with it innately, though?
It's not like that.
It's not like that. It's never equal. It's never fair. But we don't discover that until, and this is 1896, we don't really discover that until 1954 in the Brown versus the Board of Education case, when little Linda Brown decides she wants to go to a white school that's only a block away. Instead, she has to go to the black school that's 5 miles away. No busing, uphill both ways, that kind of a story. And when she takes this to court, the Supreme Court says, you know what? Inherently, whenever you divide anything or attempt to divide anything into equal parts, you keep it. It's impossible to do. They're never equal. There's no such thing as an equal back of the bus, or an equal part in the movie theater, or equal facilities. They're just not. Because one of them will feel inferior. And in this case, it was always the black race. So here, though, in 1896, what is the Supreme Court doing? They're laying their magic wand to social segregation in the South, to Jim Crow laws, and saying, it's okay, as long as everybody. Again, what's interesting about this case is that it, along with that case over there, makes up a couple of cases that demonstrate our ability to not formally amend or change the Constitution, but informally. No amendments are passed here. I mean, from between Plessy, Ferguson, and Brown. They are here. The 13th literally says no slavery. Okay, so now we sort of go in and find ways to segregate ourselves. But this is an example of informal amendment to the Constitution. We just change our look of the Constitution. One time we're looking over here saying, no, we should be separate but equal, that's fine. 60 years later, we look over here and say, this is ridiculous. You can't do that anymore. The Constitution doesn't allow it. We have to protect the rights of all citizens. It's a change of view. And that's why I put it in. Plessy Ferguson. One, you know the story. Gotta get something above. What was the outcome? Supreme Court said, we find no reason to exclude social segregation. It's fine. What's the establishment? Separate but equal. For the next 60 years, the endorsement of the Supreme Court to separate blacks and whites. Let's call it. Tomorrow we're going to look at Gitlow and Brown.